our lifetime, as in many of your lifetimes, we bridge that period between those very terrible dark days of the Second World War, which were so bad for the Jewish people, and for us, we've missed the bad times and we have had the good times, but that shouldn't stop us from learning more or as much as we can about what happened before, to fulfill the adage so that we and others don't live to repeat the same history again. Yanky was brought up mainly in England. He then went to Israel for a period of 25 years, he tells me. And after that, he found his way to Ireland. He's been here for 15 years. So there's a big chunk of his life and his biography. He's very accomplished. He's a wonderful public speaker, a motivational speaker, and a guide through business and public speaking for business people and motivation. He is a writer. He has published. In fact, this society, this museum, has been host to a number of his works, which were very well received, and all of a historical nature in which he puts across his subject and his story extremely well, as you will find out again tonight. He is a copywriter, he is a communication coach, keynote speaker, corporate trainer, and as I said, he's an author. And most important of all, he is a historian, a scholar, and a gentleman. So on behalf of the Irish Jewish Historical Society, Irish Jewish Museum, I'd like to call on Yanky Fachler to tell you about his paper.
With your permission, ladies and gentlemen, before we start the main business of the evening, because of the day that's in it, because this is Yom HaShoah, the Israeli and worldwide Jewish Holocaust Memorial Day, would you mind if we stood for a minute's silence in memory of the Holocaust victims? Thank you. So, welcome to what I believe is the fourth meeting of the Jewish Historical Society of Ireland under the auspices of this lovely museum. And the subject this evening is the blue and white flag, the Jewish flag that flew over the ghetto meaning the Warsaw Ghetto. This year is 70 years since the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And of course we will be looking at that in the course of the evening. But before I get into the Warsaw Ghetto, allow me to give you a bit of background, and if some of you have heard this before, my apologies, but I think it's relevant to discuss a little bit of my personal background and my family's relationship with Poland. 2 years after the Second World War broke out, my father received a letter from the Polish army in exile in Britain, inviting him to appear before the Polish recruiting committee. Now, my father was born in Berlin, in Germany, and he only paid one visit at the age of 5 to Poland. But his parents were Polish Jews. His nationality, therefore, was Polish. So that's why, at the age of 17, 18, he gets a letter from the Polish army in exile saying, you need to join the Polish army. They knew where he was because he came to England officially. He came on the Kindertransport program. More of that in a couple of minutes. My father, Eli, receives this invitation and he point blank refuses. No way, he says, am I going to fight for the army of an anti-Semitic nation, Poland. Now, luckily, whichever way you look at it, a few hundred other Jewish Poles or Polish Jews of army age who'd reached Britain through the Kindertransport or other means. And of course, Poland was what's called a friendly alien country, as opposed to people who had German nationality and they were enemy aliens. This had a meaning, of course, in terms of the internment to the Isle of Man. So my dad escaped all of that because he was a friendly alien. So lots of friendly aliens also refused to fight in or for the Polish army in exile. So many, in fact, that the British Army enacted emergency legislation saying, okay, if you don't fight for the Polish Free Army, and there were a few other free armies in England at the time, you must join the British Army. The British Army, said my father, Pavakasha, of course, I'll join the British Army. And so he did. January the 20th, 1942, we got a certificate from the Poles saying you no longer have to join our army, and on March the 10th, 1944, he joins the British Army. He reported for basic training at the Primary Training Wing Pioneer Corps Invicta Lines in Maidstone, and he became a lance corporal in charge of training recruits who were going over to France for the D-Day landings. He actually never left Britain in the build-up to the landings. He stayed in the army for 3 years, but he stayed in England. I happen to believe that he was probably the first member of the Fachler family to serve in any army for probably a few hundred years. And the only other person at that time in the wider family who was serving in an army was an uncle of his, the only uncle who escaped the Holocaust in Poland, the only person in Poland who wasn't murdered, because he was a communist, and so when he knew what was going on, he went east and eventually joined the Red Army. So there was probably a window of about 12 months when both of them were in uniform, both of them, of course, on the Allied side. So my first question of the evening is, why did my father refuse to fight for Poland? And I think that's an important question as a background to what we're going to be talking about this evening. Because for thousands of years, or at least 1,000 years, the Poles and the Jews had lived together. I can't say harmoniously, but they coexisted, but very, very separate. Funnily enough, I picked up a book today a friend gave me, which is one of the best descriptions of what life was like in the shtetl. And maybe one day I'll incorporate some of that into another talk, because it is so rich and it is a first-hand account. It is an actual someone describing what life was like. The Poles were passionately devoted to the Catholic religion, which taught them that the Jews had killed Jesus. And over the centuries, Polish Jews learnt there was one weekend in the year when you had to be extra, extra careful, and that, of course, was the Easter weekend. Traditionally, in medieval times and in later times throughout Europe, Easter weekend was very, very difficult because it was a tradition to use the pulpit on the Easter, Thursday, Friday, Sunday, Monday, to attack the Jews. Sometimes there were no Jews around, in which case people got all het up and nothing happened. But in Poland, of course, the Jews were right under the noses of the people who were hearing these fiery anti-Semitic sermons. By the time Poland became a sovereign state in 1918, because until then it was carved up and always belonged to somebody else, Polish anti-Semitism had become harsh and pervasive in public life. Officially, when the Polish state was created, it had freedoms for everybody, but in practice, we know it wasn't so. Jews weren't allowed to work in the civil service. Very few Jews were hired as public school teachers. No Jews on the railroads. No Jews worked in state-controlled banks, state-run monopolies. Legislation forced citizens to rest on Sunday, which meant that Jews who wanted to work on a Sunday because they couldn't work on Shabbat, they had no business. Jobless Jews were excluded from welfare benefits, a whole load of subtle anti-Semitic, even if they weren't laws, this was the practice. At the universities, Jewish enrollment was restricted. Jews had to sit in a segregated area of the classroom. In 1921, Jews made up 24.6% of the student population in Poland, and by 1938, this was down to 8%. So just in Poland in those 17 years, a drastic reduction in the number of Jews allowed to study in university. Under the guise of animal rights, the Poles forbade the Jews to do shchita, ritual slaughter, and things got progressively worse in the late 1930s as a national boycott of Jewish shops and businesses. And of course, this is mirrored by, or is a mirror of, what was happening in Nazi Germany with the same policies. Now, in late 1938, Germany decided it was going to get rid of its Jewish Poles, or Polish Jews, whichever way you want to say. When Poland heard that Germany wanted to send back thousands of Jews, they enacted legislation which meant that Jews outside Poland had to re-register for their passports in such a complicated way that it was almost impossible to get your passport renewed. And they thought, aha, we've beaten the Germans, we won't get those Jews back. And the Germans retaliated on the 27th of October 1938 with something called the Polian Aktion, the action against the Poles. And they arrested some 15,000 Polish Jews that night, including my grandfather, my father's father, and carted them off back to Poland. Took them to the Polish border and said, here, that's the way you go, you cross there. And the Polish guards, the border guards, wouldn't let them in. So here you had about 10,000, some had somehow, I don't know how they did it, but about 10,000 are now stuck in this hamlet. It's a railway siding called Zbążyn, and they can't go back to Germany, and they can't go into Poland. And they stay there for several months in pretty harsh, difficult conditions. The story is quite well known. The Greenspan family was one of the families there with my father in Zbążyn, with my grandfather in Zbążyn. A postcard got sent to Paris where the son was a student. The student got so upset at what was happening to his parents in Zbążyn that he went and bought a gun. He went to the German embassy in Paris and he assassinated the third secretary. The German retaliation was to implement a plan which they had had long in the planning, long in the making, which we all know, of course, as Kristallnacht. A matter of 10, 11 days later, on the 9th of November. Kristallnacht, with all the details that we probably most of us know, one of the main consequences of Kristallnacht, apart from the terrible damage and the murder of the people and the incarceration of, I thought it was only a few thousand Jews, and again, this week I came across another source which said that 25,000 Jews were arrested on Kristallnacht. That's a number I hadn't heard before. One good consequence was that the Jews in Britain woke up and said, we have to do something. And together with Christian organizations in Britain, they very, very quickly were galvanized into action. They went to the government and they said, you have to let kids in. They knew that the government would not allow in adults. They knew enough about British immigration policy. But they said, let in kids, allow them to stay here for the duration of the difficult times in Europe, and when it's all over, let them go on to Palestine. And that was the deal that the British government struck with these emergency committees. It didn't come cheap. £50, which was a lot of money in those days, £50 per child had to be raised as guarantee in England, in Britain, so that each child could come over. And the Kindertransport program brought eventually 10,000 children who otherwise, there's very little doubt, the vast majority of them would have perished. Because those of them who had siblings, the siblings didn't survive, and those of them who had parents, which was all of them, an infinitesimal number of Kindertransport kids ever saw their parents again. So that was, in fact, my father's situation. He was one of those children chosen for the Kindertransport program and, in fact, arrived in May 1938 in England. And that's why, because he was Polish, because he wasn't German, he gets called up by the Polish government in exile. So let's move swiftly to the Warsaw Ghetto. Now that I've given you some background about where I fit in to the Polish experience. The Warsaw Ghetto was established by the German Governor-General Hans Frank in October 1940. Jews in Warsaw and its suburbs are rounded up. 400,000 people, that's about 30% of the population of Warsaw, were squeezed into a ghetto that was 2.4% the size of Warsaw. So you can understand already what an intolerable situation the ghetto was in the first place. Average food rations in 1941 for Jews in Warsaw was limited to 184 calories. Now, anyone knows that is deliberate starvation. And indeed, about 100,000 ghetto residents didn't wait to be killed or carted off or murdered. They died from starvation. 1942, between Tisha B'Av, July the 23rd, and Yom Kippur, September the 21st, and I mention these Hebrew festivals or special days because the Nazis had this incredible knack of deliberately choosing Jewish holy days, fast days, happy days, to time a lot of their actions. And this was not a coincidence and not random. So in that very short period of July, August, September, 3 months, 250,000 Jews were deported from the ghetto and murdered in the Treblinka death camp. So the vast majority of Warsaw Ghetto's Jews had disappeared already by the end of 1942. This only left about 60,000 Jews left in the Warsaw Ghetto. And this was the point where young Jews in the ghetto started forming armed self-defense units. And I want to concentrate on those units because they're very intricate to the story of this evening. The main one was known as the Jewish Combat Organization. I'm not going to try and pronounce the Polish, but it was known as ZOB. ZOB was the main resistance unit. Now, it was an anti-fascist alliance formed by socialist Zionist youth groups like HaShomer HaTzair and Dror HeChalutz, the general Zionist youth group, they weren't Labour, they weren't revisionist, they were somewhere in the middle, called Akiva, not Bnei Akiva, this is Akiva. And this is the really interesting thing about ZOB. They were soon joined by other socialist Zionist youth groups in the ghetto, smaller ones, and by the anti-Zionist socialist Bund, B-U-N-D, that many people will have heard of. Because for decades, certainly since the beginning of Zionism, the biggest enemy of Zionism within the Jewish population in Europe was the Bund. Because the Bund were extreme socialists verging on communists, and they regarded Zionism as the wrong way for Jews to go. They thought that Jews should join the workers of the world unite, and they would be in the vanguard, and they often were in the vanguard. And so what's interesting is that the left-wing socialist Jewish Zionist groups merge with the anti-Zionist Bund to create this anti-fascist alliance called ZOB. And there were some Jewish communists, proper, open communists as well, and they also joined. rough estimates put the size of the ZOB when it was formed at about 200 members and maybe 500 at its peak. Most of these kids, teenagers, were untrained, and they weren't trusted by the Gentile Polish underground because of their strong pro-Soviet views. Poland was this crazy mixture of anti-Soviet, anti-Nazi, and anti-Semitic. It's very difficult to be all three. The Poles managed it. So the glue that kept ZOB together was a shared hatred, not just of the Nazis, but of the other Jewish resistance group, the Jewish Military Union, the ZZW. I'm sure that there are people in the room here who have heard of ZOB and hadn't heard of ZZW. I'm guessing that because they are almost non-existent in any of the well-known histories of the Warsaw Uprising. Who were they? They were created by the revisionist party, Jabotinsky's revisionist party. The right-wing Zionists, followers of Jabotinsky, the one-time British officer who was the driving force behind the Jewish Legion in World War I, and those of you with long memories stretching back at least 2 years will remember that I've spoken about the formation of the Jewish Legion. Consisting largely of members of the Beitar youth movement. Now, Beitar is Brit Trumpeldor, that's it, Brit Trumpeldor. Joseph Trumpeldor was the Russian, one-armed Russian army officer, Jewish, who also was involved in the formation of the Zion Mule Corps with Jabotinsky and the Jewish Legion. So the smaller group in the ZZW actually had much better relations with the Polish underground, A, because they were anti-communist, B, because they had fought, some of them, in the Polish army. So their mates who were in the Polish underground, there was a level of trust that didn't exist with ZOB, and that's also important to remember. And they were better armed because they were getting some supply of small arms and ammunition. ZOB was led by someone who most people would have heard of, who've ever heard of the Warsaw Ghetto, Mordechai Anilewicz. He was the guy who ran his operation from a very famous address made famous by Leon Uris, Mila 18, number 18, Mila Street. That's where he had his headquarters. ZZW was led by somebody called Pavel Frankel, who nobody has heard of. So the question is, why did these two Jewish anti-Nazi groups, faced with the extinction of the ghetto, not do the obvious thing and join forces? Well, I think there are several answers. The fratricidal animosity is really what it's about. ZOB considered them to be a semi-fascist movement. And they could not bring themselves to join forces. The social Zionists found it easier to bring in the anti-Zionist Bund and communists rather than contemplate uniting with the ZZW. Those of us who were here a few months ago, we heard Professor Katz telling us that the first manifestation of resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto was several months before the famous uprising. January 1943, German SS and police units tried to resume mass deportation of the Jews. They got rid of most, 60,000 left, right, it's time to get rid of the rest. And a group of Jewish fighters armed with pistols infiltrated a column of Jews being forced to the transfer point and onto death camps, and at a prearranged signal broke ranks and fought with their German escorts. This was the first instance of armed uprising against the Nazis. Now, most of the Jewish people that did that, most of the fighters, they died in the fighting. But the Germans put off their plan for 3 more months. They realized that it's not going to be quite as easy as before, because for the first time, and don't forget, Nazi soldiers had never, ever, ever come across any resistance. So although this was very localized, they thought, we'll pause on this one. They waited 3 months. They did seize 5,000 to 6,000 ghetto residents to be deported, but they left the rest. Now, encouraged by the success in halting those deportations in January, both ZOB and ZZW each started building subterranean bunkers and shelters. I mean, they both had the same idea, and it was an obvious idea. We're going to fight to the death. The Germans are coming back. They're not going to leave us alone, but we are going to be much better prepared this time. And they started building this amazing warren of underground tunnels. ZZW managed to dig 2 tunnels under the ghetto walls, providing contact with the outside and allowing the smuggling of arms into the ghetto. So they actually they were better armed. They had a small supply coming in from their friends on the other side. I mentioned the Nazis' habit of choosing Jewish special days. So what day did they choose to launch the final attack to get rid of all the rest of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto? The one day in the year when Jews celebrate their freedom. Erev Pesach, Seder night. That was their chosen date. But when the Waffen-SS and police units under the Nazi commander Samen Frankenberg entered the ghetto that morning, supported by a tank, they found the streets deserted, which was very unusual. Nearly all the residents had gone into hiding places or bunkers, which means that the 2 small underground combat units had persuaded everybody to disappear into the bunkers. And suddenly the Germans found themselves pinned down by firing. The Warsaw Ghetto Revolt had begun. That was the official beginning. The Germans came in and suddenly they were being fired upon. They had no idea from where. They couldn't work it out at first. And this was definitely the very first large-scale uprising.